Hello, friends. Welcome. Today is Wednesday, October 25th, and great to have you joining us on Read Through the Word. Today, we're going to kind of do a bit of a history lesson on what I think is such an interesting political climate of Jesus's day. If we think sometimes we think our political climate is kind of a mess and complicated and fighting factions and things, but it was just as dicey in Jesus's day. So we're actually going to kind of dive in, because what's interesting is that when Jesus responds to people, and we don't always, we might not always think of it that way, but when he responds to people in the New Testament, he is fully aware, there's this political, religious, there's this whole dynamic going on with different groups of people and kind of what they want, what they stand for, what their thing is. And so it's helpful to know a little bit about all these groups, because it helps to know maybe why Jesus responded in certain ways. And I think it also gives us a picture of, like, when we get closer to the crucifixion of Jesus, again, it gives us this picture of this large conglomerate of factions that each had their own desires and their own role to play in all of this in the Gospels. So our key verse is Matthew 22:37 through 40, our key verses. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." So what's interesting is that's our key verse that we're going to end up at. But I really want the focus to be on Matthew 22, verses 15 through 40, because this is an interesting section where Jesus is dealing with several different groups here. The Pharisees, go out and they plan to trap him in his words. Then they send their disciples to him along with the Herodians. And then a few verses down, we see the Sadducees coming to trap him in their words. And then the Pharisees and the Sadducees, it says, hearing that Jesus silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. So there's all these different groups kind of trying to trap Jesus in his words and try to make their point or retain their own power. So that's the focus that I want to look at. And within that context, we're going to go through and talk a little bit about each of these groups and then end it with, why does it matter? The Pharisees, are you ready? It's our first group. They were ardent nationalists, opposed to Roman rule, a political and religious sect. Their group survived the destruction of the temple. In other words, in AD 70, the Pharisees really, after that point, they kind of became like the leaders, the keepers of modern Judaism. Okay, so their group continues on. I'm going to look here. I am quoting quite a bit from the Archaeological Bible today. Another interesting point about the Pharisees here. It says that the exact meaning of the term Pharisee in the original language remains uncertain. The noun derives from the Hebrew verb meaning to separate or to distinguish. The title appears to have been originally applied in a negative sense when the Pharisees were expelled from membership in the Sanhedrin under John Hyrcanus, I don't know if I said that right, in BC 135 to 104. Though it was later understood in a positive sense, either as those who separated themselves from all sources of ritual uncleanness, or those who interpreted the law precisely. So there wasn't always necessarily a good connotation, but it appears that at some point they did end up having a more positive connotation as, these were the people that like helped people keep the law. The Pharisees, okay? Next, we're going to go to the group, the Sadducees. They were a religious and political sect, though definitely more politically minded than the Pharisees, a wealthy and sophisticated kind of aristocratic class. They controlled the temple worship. Many were members of the Sanhedrin. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead because they only accepted the books of Moses, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. They denied the existence of spirits and angels, which again, this tells us why Jesus responded as he did. In Matthew 22, verse 32, he quotes when he talks about because they're trying to trap him about being about marriage and the resurrection, and Jesus says, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the God of not of the dead but of the living. And he quotes Exodus 3:6 instead of quoting the prophets, because that's what the Sadducees would accept. They accept the first 5 books of Moses. So when Jesus responded to them, he doctrinally used the verses that he knew they would accept as part of their belief system. Now, did they accept his answer? I don't know. But he knew, right? He responded to what he knew their thinking was like. All right, let's continue with the Sadducees. We know they controlled temple worship. Sorry, I said that one. Okay. They were kind of rivals with the Pharisees. They denied the validity of the oral law. So the oral law was kind of like, that's what the Pharisees advocated. They, all the rabbinic teachings and interpretations and how that they thought people should follow the law. The Sadducees denied the validity of that oral law. They thought, look, we only accept what was in the first 5 books of Moses. So they denied kind of the oral tradition. Their influence virtually ceased with the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And I think that's interesting. We'll talk about that at the end. Now, both the Pharisees and the Sadducees seem like a real big part of the Gospels, don't they? It's interesting, though, they were actually relatively few in number compared to, the total Jewish population. But they exerted a ton of political and religious, very powerful influence. Can we relate to that? Small groups of people that sometimes have a lot of influence. That was the Pharisees and Sadducees. Sure, there were, a great number of them, but in relation, in proportion to the Jewish population, they weren't like huge groups of people. Okay, the next group, the Herodians. So they supported the rule of the Herods, and obviously, therefore, the rule of Rome. They're mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. And they joined the Pharisees, and each time they're mentioned, they're joining the Pharisees in opposition to Jesus. They probably didn't like Jesus rocking the boat in a way that might threaten their good ties with Rome. All right, let's talk about the chief priests, those of the high priestly line of descent, mainly Sadducees, in charge of worship at the temple. The ruling high priest was Caiaphas, former priest Annas, and high priestly families that were included in the Sanhedrin. And what was the Sanhedrin? The highest Jewish council in Jerusalem under the leadership of the high priest. There were 71 members, reflecting the biblical practice instituted by Moses, where there were 70 leaders and then Moses. Going to read a little bit from the Archaeological Bible about the Sanhedrin. Just an interesting fact here. The idea of a ruling council composed of leading aristocratic citizens reflected the structure of Greek civic constitutions. The high priestly aristocracy played a leading role from the outset, but the Sanhedrin was gradually forced to make way for lay representatives drawn largely from the Pharisees. During the New Testament period, the Jerusalem Sanhedrin consisted of a somewhat mutually hostile mixture of aristocratic, priestly Sadducees and learned lay Pharisees. Members in the Sanhedrin were conferred by appointment and accompanied by a ceremony of ordination through the laying on of hands. The most interesting thing that I found in that little bit was they didn't really get along. Okay. The teachers of the law, there's our next group, professionally trained Jewish scholars. They were not always Pharisees. And the next two groups are not mentioned in our reading today, but I just wanted to give a little snippet about them because it's, again, an interesting part of the sort of atmosphere of Jesus's day. And those two groups are the Zealots, which of course were the radical Jews who sought the violent overthrow of Rome, came to prominence during the Jewish revolt in AD 66. Oh wait, I said that wrong. I don't think that's supposed to be, okay, I'm not sure I have that date right, but okay, the Essenes is another group. They were sort of a reform movement that arose out of the Maccabean revolt, concerned with strict adherence to the law, like the Pharisees, but sometimes differed with the Pharisees on what kind of the interpretation of the law was. And again, I'm going to read a little snippet about the Essenes. Okay. The Essenes, oops, I lost my place here. Okay, the Essenes were noted for, all right, I'll find it. Here we go. For their ascetic tendencies, their non-participation in temple worship, and their desire to isolate themselves in tight-knit communities. Some of the more radical Essenes, who followed the so-called teacher of righteousness, eventually gave up hope of renewal through normal channels and withdrew to the Judean wilderness to live together near the Dead Sea. So kind of a group that sort of went off by themselves and became more isolated. A huge contrast to the Zealots, right? Who were like, we're here, we're sort of in your face, we're aggressive. All right. All of those groups, right? Every time, when Jesus was talking, when he's preaching, when he's healing people, at any given moment, there could be surrounding him and the disciples, people from all different kinds of groups that we just talked about. That's a pretty big mess, isn't it? And I'm sure it added to the tension of the day. So, as we see in Matthew 22, it's not just Pharisees and Sadducees sort of asking him a question. There's Herodians, there's the Sanhedrin, priests, teachers of the law, maybe Zealots and Essenes, like whatever. There's a lot of people that are present during these times. And Jesus forms his words in certain ways to directly address these kinds of groups. So here's just a couple things in conclusion that I think were kind of interesting. One, the Sadducees, basically once the temple was destroyed in AD 70, they really, for the most part, lost all influence and kind of ceased to continue on in their role. And I think that's interesting. It's almost like, not that God wanted the temple destroyed, but in that happening, it's almost like God is saying about the Sadducees, you don't get to control this, right? The temple is what? We're the temple. We as individuals and as the church, we're supposed to constitute the temple, right? The the body of Christ, where Jesus indwells us and the church. And we don't need a Sadducee to oversee that, right? So I thought that was interesting. Another interesting thing, that all of these people were sort of like at odds with each other, or all of these groups. But the one thing they had in common, they all couldn't stand Jesus. And they all wanted to really kind of push up against him or use him for their purposes or whatever. They were each so concerned about their own power that they were willing to sort of join ranks with people who they didn't agree with, all for the common purpose of opposing Jesus. And the final thing I think is interesting is our key verse. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. So all these people are questioning. You have all these groups with all their ideas, their factions, their need for power. They're all trying to get the upper hand, all of this, and they're questioning him. And Jesus gives this verse at such an interesting time. Like, this is not unintentional that this verse came out at this time. He's saying, look, you Herodians, Pharisees, Sadducees, whatever, all of you people who keep fighting with each other and trying to fight with me, you missed it. Right? You miss the most important commandment of all. Love God and love your neighbor. And none of you, I'm sure he's thinking, none of you are doing that. And, we don't want to say none of you because you can't put everybody in a box. But in general, all this opposition and questioning and factions and political and religious strife. And he's saying, love God, love your neighbor. You're fighting for all your own power, and you're missing the most important thing. Love God, love your neighbor. A good reminder for us today, in the midst of whatever contention is out there in the world. Thank you, and we'll see you again on Read Through the Word.